Well,
Yeah, making sure that I have a shot of it.
Thank you for joining us. We're here as part of a moment of reflection about a popular movement that's kind of caught us all by surprise and caught the world by storm. And this movement, known collectively as Occupy Wall Street, has morphed from a very specific location in downtown New York City to locations in metropolitan areas worldwide. And myself and my faculty colleagues thought that this moment was too pregnant with significance to let it pass without interacting with you over what it all means and how it relates to our fields of communication and journalism. So we gathered here today over this lunchtime hour to just spend a few minutes looking at where this movement came from, what it seems to be striving to achieve, and how it relates to particular topics of interest that our faculty teach, research, and write about continually. So I'm going to be joined today. My name is Chris Smith, and I'm the co-director of the Media Economics and Entrepreneurship Initiative here at the school. I'm also a professor in the Communications School. And I'm going to be joined today by my co-director for MTV, Gabriel Kahn, who's a journalism professor and also the former bureau chief in Los Angeles for the Wall Street Journal. And to his left is Marc Cooper, journalism faculty member and very celebrated reporter. To his left, Thomas Holligan, communication professor just back from China, who will be looking at this movement from an international perspective, from the domain where we're seeing a huge new capitalist behemoth rising on the global stage. And across the table from him is Judy Muller, also a journalism professor. We'll be joined by Bob Scheer, Dan Durbin, and Allison Trout, all in the School of Communications. So our goal here, and one of the primary goals of the Media Economics and Entrepreneurship Initiative, is to bring together our faculty across journalism and communication to discuss topics that arise that will lend themselves to looking at them through an economic lens. So I'm going to kick things off by just spending a few minutes putting the Occupy Wall Street movement into a little bit of historical perspective. So Occupy Wall Street is a movement that frequently is said to not really have a clear point of view. On the one hand, that's one of its strengths. Many people argue that's one of its weaknesses. But one of the things that makes the movement so powerful is that it's tapping into a real spirit of discontent, frustration, and anger that the American people have and feel about the state of the American economy. And one aspect of that frustration that this movement is tapped into is the escalating rate of income disparity in the U.S. For the better part of a generation, wealth and income disparity has been viewed as a benign factor of American life, and in fact, just a natural byproduct of a rugged free market capitalist system. But what this Occupy Wall Street movement is doing in the wake of the market meltdown is recast this fact of life in America and in the Anglo-American West generally as something that we need to really take seriously as a problem. And so this feeling that the Occupy Wall Street movement is tapping into about how we should regard inequality really is sadly bolstered by a lot of very disturbing, recent socioeconomic statistics. The last batch of statistics revealed that in 2010, almost 3 million Americans had fallen below the poverty line. And as you've heard time and time again, if you've been following the Occupy Wall Street coverage, the top 1% of our fellow U.S. citizens control more than 40% of the country's wealth. So the Occupy Wall Street movement in its depiction of this in the 1% relative to the 99%, is tapping into this idea that our system, our socioeconomic system, has gotten skewed to the extent that the vast majority of people no longer feel like the engine of social mobility is functioning anymore. And they're very upset about that. They're confused. I shouldn't say we, on some level, I'm confused and don't necessarily know what this all means for my future, the future of my children, etc. So just teasing out that one aspect of what the movement is targeting, income disparity, we can ask, where did this income disparity come from? And so what I want to spend just a few minutes more doing is looking at the broad historical sweep that provides a backdrop for income disparity at this moment. So many analysts trace the roots of the great divergence of fortune in American life today to the shift in Washington policymaking circles toward a smaller government philosophy. And for the better part of the generation, beginning in the 1970s actually, and really crystallizing in the early 1980s, the trend has been toward reversing the growth of government. And so neoliberalism is the name that's frequently ascribed to the philosophy that undergirds this turn towards smaller government. And particularly in academic circles, you hear the phrase neoliberalism used all the time, particularly by academicians from the political left, to describe the philosophy that guides this turn away from government. And in shorthand, neoliberalism can be understood as an ideology that puts forward the belief that unfettered private financial markets are better able to generate the economic output we want than government. That unfettered, unregulated, unleashed, high computing power enabled finance can guide society towards the progressive outcomes we want better than activist government. And the interesting thing about neoliberalism as a catchphrase in capturing this philosophical belief system is how recently the neoliberalist agenda, if you can call it that, has dominated the American state. For the better part of the 20th century, there was a completely different philosophical philosophy that guided our politics. And that philosophy grew out of the great disruption that was initiated by the stock market crash of 1929 that really ushered in a new era of activist government. And the economists that really symbolized this belief system that the depression and the stock market crash and the resulting depression ushered in was the great economist John Maynard Keynes, who wrote a book in the teeth of the depression called The General Theory of Employment, Interest in Money, that put forward the idea that government could orchestrate economic growth, particularly in times of crisis, by utilizing fiscal policy, which frequently would include deficit spending, and monetary policy, interest rate fluctuation by the central bank, to guide economic growth in substitute for flagging private demand. If you know anything about economics, you know that the great catalyst for the deflationary spiral in the Depression was absence of private demand. So Keynes' idea was government could substitute at those moments of crisis where there wasn't private firm investiture, spending, hiring, and private individual spending by providing a stimulus through big government programs. And so that really, through the programs that Franklin Delano Roosevelt ushered in, that really became the watchword. Sorry, there's another window up behind there. That really became the watchword of our political agenda. The government had a strong role to play in driving economic fortunes of the people. And in the post-World War II era, activist government was also seen as the way forward in rebuilding the devastation in Europe. So activist government under the Marshall Plan was all about utilizing the power of government to rebuild entire regions and entire nations. So coming out of World War II as well, there was put in place an international financial system at a conference called Bretton Woods that cemented the U.S.'s singular role in driving the world's economic engine. And so what I just want to pause and say here is that at this moment, coming out of World War II, where we've defeated the Depression, we've defeated the Axis powers in Europe, we cement in place this belief system that activist government can win wars, can rebuild regions, can rebuild devastated nations, can rebuild our own economic fortunes, and the post-War II era, mid-20th century era is defined by the idea that private prosperity it flows out of a strong government spending proposition. But by the dawn of the 1970s, a new set of forces seemed to indicate that that Keynesian model was no longer appropriate. Beginning in the 1970s, we had new patterns of interconnectivity emerge around the world. U.S. insularity was disturbed by the oil shocks of the early 1970s, and people began to rethink this idea that a Keynesian economic model really was still appropriate for the new dawning era of globalization. And so when you see these symbols of urban decay in the South Bronx, these became symbolic of this new American malaise and a symptom of the decline of the Keynesian agenda. So beginning in 1971, Nixon turns away from the Bretton Woods system and a new global financial regime dawns. And from thenceforth, the idea was instead of activist government, the marketplace was going a free, unfettered, increasingly global, increasingly ICT-enabled financial system was going to drive the way forward. So the financial system begins to be thought of as the primary lever to get a new type of flexibility in managing economic systems. And so the rational market theorizations of Chicago school economists reached an apotheosis with the Black-Scholes-Merton option pricing model in the early 1970s, and coupled with increasingly powerful computing, you get the dawn of financialization. And from early 1970s forward, you have the idea that finance and all the new types of innovative products that would develop would substitute for activist government and provide shock absorption for global geopolitical shocks, financial shocks, and give us a more flexible system. So politically, the underpinnings for the spread of this new pro-market ideology was figured by the rise of Margaret Thatcher in Britain, the rise of Ronald Reagan here in 1979 and 80, and in his inaugural address in 1981, Reagan put his finger on what he thought was the culprit for the malaise we suffered in the 1970s, and he said very clearly in his inaugural address that government is not the solution to the problems we face, but it's the problem itself. So big government was put forward as the reason why we experienced so much economic instability in the 70s, and the dismantling of government began in earnest. And one of the chief hallmarks of that dismantling of government was the idea that with fewer regulations, private industry would lead us forward. So there's a great quote that I just want to suggest to you is worth paying attention to. It kind of expresses what this turn away from Keynesianism sounds like from an intellectual perspective. And it wasn't made in the 1970s, it wasn't uttered in the 1970s or 80s, it was uttered many, many years later when then Federal Reserve Board Chairman Alan Greenspan gave a speech to the annual convention of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, perhaps Gabe, you might have been there, in Washington, D.C., April 2nd, 1998, where he says very clearly that at this moment of dawning globalization, he says, for good or ill, an unforgiving capitalist process is driving wealth creation. It has become increasingly difficult for policymakers who wish to practice, as they put it, a more caring capitalism to realize the full potential of their economy. Their choices have become limited To the extent they block themselves or portions of their population from what they perceive as harsh competitive pressures, they must accept the lower average standard of living for their populace. As a consequence, increasingly nations appear to be opting to open themselves to competition, however harsh, and become producers that compete in world markets. Governments of all persuasions may still choose to help people acquire the skills they need to utilize new technologies which are driving the new trends of wealth creation, and they generally endeavor to support the incomes of those who have been less able to adapt. But technology and competition are extracting a high price for more intrusive forms of intervention that impair market incentives to work, save, invest, and innovate. That's the death of Keynesianism in a nutshell. This idea that to compete in the ever more cutthroat economy ushered in by globalization, the safety net that had been ushered in by FDR in the late 30s and early 40s is no longer tenable, is no longer sustainable. And as China moved more toward a market sensibility and the Soviet Union collapsed, we appear to have evidence that moving away from Keynesianism had been ratified by the world, and that this was a system that had merit. And when we looked at the evidence of shortages that centrally planned economies afflicted their people with, we appear to have palpable evidence that the flexibility of the free market was much better able to unleash the kind of abundance that we can witness even in the average 99-cent store. So when we juxtapose this kind of banality of abundance with the deprivation of centrally planned economies, we look to have perfect evidence that the free market ethos had won out, and we have reached the end of history. And as Greenspan said in another speech, in that same speech, he said the lesson of all this that appears to be emerging is that only free market systems exhibit the flexibility and robustness to accommodate human nature, harness rapidly advancing technology, and consistently advance living standards. And as one of his colleagues, Alice Rivlin, said at a speech before the Foreign Policy Association, she said in 1999, she said the United States a century in finds itself with the best functioning, most productive economy in the world, bar none. That is our great fortune. Lucky us. So at this millennial moment, it looked like the turn away from Keynesianism had emerged triumphant. The free market was the way to go. The world was increasingly moving in this direction, and everything was going to be the great moderation and happily ever after. But the irony is that at this very moment, the move toward a finance-enabled global system unleashed a new social order that increasingly was more a la winner-take-all. And the haves, those people who have products, services, even just mere celebrity or anything else that they can sell in the global market have benefited mightily from globalization. But for most of society, particularly the undereducated, globalization has meant an incredible washout of their prospects. And so beginning at that moment when Reagan gave his inauguration speech, our society has been increasingly separated between the haves and the have-nots. We've seen this great divergence where the richest 5% of households from the early 80s on have seen their fortunes escalate. The vast majority of everyone else seen their fortunes gradually deteriorate. During the heyday of post-World War II Keynesianism, every income quintile in the population saw their fortunes rise. All boats were rising by the tide of economic fortune. With the turn to financialization and free marketeering, we see the growing apart of these quintiles, with the top 5% benefiting from globalization at a far higher rate, and the only thing compensating from the gap is the growth of personal credit and people taking on more debt through their home mortgages, through their credit cards, etc. So we see in this chart from 1960 on the reversal of people spending out of consumer spending as a percentage of wages goes way above 100%, which means people are getting terribly in debt. While this whole dynamic picked up steam, our political rhetoric is not kept pace. The average American has had no conceptual framework for understanding these shifts. So when the meltdown occurred, and Bob Scheer, who's joined us now, wrote a great book about some of the political antecedents to this meltdown, in his book, The Great American Stick-Up. When this blow-up occurred, and all of the blame game over who was responsible for it emerged, and it spread globally, and we're witnessing this sovereign debt crisis in Europe right now. When the floodgates of popular discontent were unleashed, it was unleashed because people were caught by surprise as to where did this all come from. No one had ever clearly and consistently articulated to them what had been going on. So we saw this in the initial wave of unrest over the bailout packages in TARP, the Toxic Asset Relief Program in 2009. That ended up leading to the Tea Party movement and to unrest in Europe. And now we're here at the Occupy Wall Street coverage. And I use this image because the reportage of this movement initially was one of depicting it as something very marginal, very much, latter-day hippies dosed out on LSD and whatever else. And the point is the movement has gained credibility, gained legitimacy. So here we are. The system predicated on the belief in self-regulatory rational markets has malfunctioned and failed. We're at a moment of a paradigm shift. We're at a turning point. Where do we go from here? Nobody really knows. So at this juncture, I'd just like to turn it over to Professor Hollenhan, who's just come back from a trip to China, a strategic initiative there, and he noticed some very interesting things about the Chinese coverage of all of this.
Thank you, Lynn. That was a very good question. I apologize that I have to leave in 10 minutes to go teach my class, which I've been away from for 10 days.
It's occupied.
Yeah, it may have been. Ernie Wilson and I spent 10 days in Beijing and in Hong Kong, and so when Chris said, gee, wouldn't you love to come and participate in this, I said, sure, I'd love to, but I've really been away from the American news coverage. I've been watching the news coverage in China. And that was interesting enough that he was going to invite me to talk about that. I'm going to be summarizing a few things I saw, looking both at media coverage and at interactions I had. The interactions included lectures I gave at 3 journalism and communication schools in China, and conversations, therefore, with senior faculty and academic leaders at those campuses, as well as students, both undergraduate and graduate students, and in at least one instance, students from many developing nations of the world, which was an interesting opportunity. In addition, Ernie and I spent some time with senior government officials, and that's a separate little story that I'll weave in at a point. And then we moved on to Hong Kong, and as you might expect, the way this Occupy Wall Street looked to people in Hong Kong was pretty dramatically different than it looked to people in Beijing. First, about coverage in the People's Republic of China, what I noticed, and I do want to say that I'm reading English language Chinese newspapers. I obviously am not reading Chinese. I don't speak Chinese, although I'm interacting with mostly colleagues, journalism professors, and students who are reading the coverage in Chinese and giving me their perceptions of it. What you notice, first of all, from the way China viewed this controversy is the most noteworthy thing I would say is they magnified the extent of what was happening in the United States. The language, the images, everything that accounted for what was happening in the United States makes it look more like Tunisia and Arab Spring than, tent city outside City Hall where they're running electrical cords from the mayor's office to help keep the lights on. This was viewed as the United States literally coming to the very verge of catastrophe. Indeed, the Global Times, which is an English language Chinese newspaper, said, quote, the Occupy Wall Street movement might be the final straw under which America collapses. So that gives you some sort of sense of how this controversy is viewed from that perspective. Secondly, I would say that they take every opportunity to cite what was happening in the Wall Street protests as an indication of the gross social inequality and failure of the United States to have delivered on its promise of a capitalist paradise. Not surprisingly, given the United States posturing about China and issues of human rights, and how the U.S. tends to characterize the relationship between the Chinese people and their government, it shouldn't completely surprise us to see that Chinese, and I'm talking students, I'm talking professors, and not just government officials, say this is really a sign that the U.S. capitalist system has failed. And it was humorous in some sense to me, because I would say, well, you know, these income disparities I'm seeing in China are really pretty great right now. And they go, oh yeah, but we're working on it. You know, we've raised the living standards of millions of people, which admittedly they have. But they tend to see the dislocation in the U.S. economy is even more substantive than that, which is occurring in their own, which I think is noteworthy. The third thing I would say is that elite audiences, government audiences, senior academic leaders, not necessarily the journalism professors or communication professors that I would go to dinner with outside of the meetings, but the university administrators who would shake my hand and discuss what was happening around the world, would frequently talk about Cameron's comments in the UK about how the violence in London probably suggests that some form of control of social media is going to be essential. And so these comments got frequently thrown up as a measure of vindication of the Chinese policy of information control and control explicitly over social networking, to say, look what happens if protests and social media permits mobs to begin to develop and to, move out from city to city across the world. And don't you agree that this suggests that the U.S. is also going to have to control social media? These folks seemed largely surprised, and I mean, I'm talking about well-educated Chinese here, seemed largely surprised when I said, I don't think that'll happen in the United States, at least as a result of these protests. It might happen as a result of anxiety about global terrorist networks or something. But I said, furthermore, one has to understand there's a culture of public protest in the United States. And unless the police overreact with violence, I think, in fact, these protests will be so widely accepted that they'll come to be taken for granted, and they'll just lose interest of people because, they'll be old news. This was a great shock to the Chinese, who thought that you could have this kind of protest activity and not invoke government anxiety was just positively an impossibility. The last thing I would say in the People's Republic is that the narrative framing for the story linked the events in Occupy Wall Street to the Senate resolution about Chinese currency manipulation, and did so most directly and quite frankly in a way that is not as illogical or unreasonable as you might think. The argument they're making is that rather than own up to the economic inequality and economic failure, or the inability to have regulated the economic system to assure an adequate distribution of wealth in the United States, the Republican leadership in the Senate is instead blaming China. And by blaming China, they're looking for somebody to scapegoat rather than to account for, which really happened here. I don't care whether the Chinese folks I met were supportive of their own government or not, and in quiet you'll find many of them are quite skeptical, if not downright cynical, about their own government, especially about their own press system. They are without exception nationalistic about the notion that the U.S. should not be meddling in Chinese economic conditions or even in human rights concerns. They tend to think that the U.S. isn't necessarily helpful when it wades into Chinese politics. So that would sort of be the last comment that I would make about what was happening in the PRC. In Hong Kong, the big news was that 500 people demonstrated on Sunday in a movement called Occupy Central. And Monday morning, which is the day that I left Hong Kong, the number that was persisting there was down to under 60. And so it wasn't a movement that had a lot of staying power, but these Hong Kong people had to get to work. There's very low unemployment in Hong Kong, and everybody's got a job. And they better show up for work, because 20% of the people of Hong Kong fall under the Hong Kong poverty line. They have terrific income disparity there. The price of housing is just exorbitantly high. And the income disparities between the wealthy elites at the top who inhabit the corporate suites and those gleaming skyscrapers you see are just extraordinary. Only this year did Hong Kong pass its first ever minimum wage legislation, which is a generous wage of $3.60 US per hour. And I can tell you that Hong Kong is not an inexpensive city. I mean, it's ridiculously overpriced. Hong Kong also has a seething issue that lays just below the surface about exploitation of immigrant domestic workers. Several years ago, Filipino maids tried to organize and conduct protest movements and had great success. The way the law works in Hong Kong, they get 1 day off a week. And that day off is Sunday, and they're free after they prepare the Sunday breakfast until 8 o'clock at night. So they get 12 hours of freedom per week. And if you travel about the city in the supermarkets or in the malls or in the parks, you'll literally see thousands of domestic workers. Well, because those protest movements were successful in attracting support, the Hong Kong government insisted that people should try to disperse the maids' day off so that they didn't all get the day off on Sunday. But they didn't come right out and argue that it was because of the protest movements. They instead said it was because of the fears about the SARS epidemic. That all those maids coming together in public spaces could create a public health hazard. And so they put a lot of pressure on. And to the good fortune of the Hong Kong government, they did resist this, in part because there were enough public protests to say that that wasn't legitimate. Because the Filipino maids, though, many of whom can speak English, and were effectively negotiating and bargaining for resources. Hong Kong has been inviting more Indonesian maids to come. And Indonesian maids are much more easily silenced. They're much less likely to have English language skills. And the real tragedy from the perspective of globalization is that they get no support from their own governments, of course, because those governments are so starved for currency that they will allow their people to go and be exploited in Hong Kong or Singapore or the Middle East, obviously, in order for the hard currency reserves to come back. So I close with this notion that even though Occupy Central may not have been a profoundly successful movement, I do think there is this real underlying level of social anxiety and protest about economic inequality. The government in Hong Kong has just, it is such a flush economy that it's returning 6,000 Hong Kong dollars per person, which is about $900 from a budget surplus. And they're now moving to try to build more public housing. But there's a lot of anxiety in Hong Kong about wage inequality. I only have a couple more minutes, but if it's okay, can I take a couple questions before I leave, since I came in under my 10 minutes? Anybody want to ask me a question?
And then I think we're going to have a longer question period at the end as well. So.
I'm sorry I have to leave, but anybody have any questions or comments? Please.
What is sort of the implicit message that is perceived abroad about Occupy in general? Is it just this social unrest about economic inequality, or is there something else?
Well, I can only talk about the one place I was. I haven't been following all global media. I thought toward the end of my stay there was a shift in the coverage that was beginning to acknowledge that the Democrats were moving to take advantage of it as a political tactic. That was different toward the end of my visit from the beginning. At the beginning of the visit, the emphasis was really about social unrest and public anger and rage. But that's in China. I mean, I can't generalize other places. Yeah.
I am from China, actually from Beijing. And one thing I want to point out is that people, especially well-educated youth generation, read the Global Times more as a joke than a journalism. And we all know that the articles on the Global Times is not journalism. It takes a very firm standing. And as far as I'm concerned, students who are studying abroad, like in the U.S., start to make comments on Occupy Wall Street from a different perspective on the social network, similarly to Facebook in China. And now, more educated, you started to rethink the Occupy Wall Street activity. I mean, it's just one thing I want to point out.
Yeah, Global Times is written in part to communicate, I think, with an expat audience in China. So I wouldn't argue that it's not mainstream, and it deviates in many senses from other Chinese publications I saw. On the comment about the social media, that's the argument I made every opportunity I had. To senior administrators who'd say, no, we're not going to change our social media policy. I said, well, do you understand you've got lots of networked Chinese now, all these overseas Chinese students, are communicating back home with the people, and so news is not able to be controlled in the same way it used to be. And I probably write 2 or 3 messages to Chinese colleagues every day via email, and so clearly.
Do they arrive?
Oh yeah. Curiously, if you just forward a New York Times or an LA Times story, it might not make it through. If you copy and paste it, it's golden.
Sure, if you want to.
All right,
Go
okay.
ahead.
Mark and I are doing this double team, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
And then,
And
on,
Bob.
talk to each other, but on Occupy Wall Street and news media and news literacy. And I was asked, I guess, because of my interest in news literacy, something I'm trying to do is here in terms of the course. Just to frame that for you, it's basically applying critical thinking skills, basically applying your brain power, and a dose of healthy skepticism, not cynicism, but skepticism, to understanding the way the information is framed and delivered. We're being bombarded by so much now. And it also takes into account the fact that the news consumer is also an active participant now in the process. So it looks at it from both of those angles. Citizen journalists are engaged in spreading the news through social media. So, but I want to start with the mainstream media and how they're reporting Occupy Wall Street. And even though they don't have the clout that they once did, the so-called gatekeepers, the anchors, the editors, and I'm talking television here, I'm going to talk mostly about television, because even though it's lost some of its clout, it is still the source of news for millions and millions of Americans, and they get much of their news from television, so I want to talk a little bit about that. Even though those gatekeepers don't have as much clout as they once did, the great white fathers who walked in Washington, New York, telling us what we should know, because of all of the other avenues of information, they do still have clout. So the problem with television, where should we begin? But the big problem is that it craves simplicity. And nuance is an endangered species on television. So when you're talking about understanding something like this, an enormous crowd, huge, with thousands of different points of view, different messages, at least it sounds like it. The simple message that will go into a 1-minute, 30-second television spot is often, well, these people really don't know what they want. They're disorganized. Because that's the easiest thing to say when you can't find one simple thing to say, which is the fault of the reporting, not the fault of the crowd. But that's often how it's done. And that's, of course, incredibly dismissive, since what they clearly want is to make it clear they're fed up with financial institutions getting away with highway robbery at their expense. They're fed up with politicians who appear to be in the pockets of those institutions. They're fed up with the government that's gridlocked in partisan bickering, can't seem to address the concerns of this economy. And fed upness at that level that seems to be growing may have a real impact on this election. So that's very, very important information. I think what you often saw in the beginning of the coverage was that they marginalized the protesters. Some of the reporting did as some sort of fringe element, which you mentioned. And jobless bums who had nothing better to do. It reminded me of the early days of reporting the Vietnam War protests, which I engaged in. Even though my father was the Deputy Secretary of the Joint Chiefs inside the Pentagon, I was protesting around the Pentagon, which was really fun times at my house. But at any rate, back then, the characterizations, were so stereotypical, and they're hippies, they're on drugs, they're flakes, and nothing better to do. And that seems to be changing in the reporting that I'm seeing. It's becoming, if there is any such thing as nuance in television, it's getting there. Another factor at work here is the increasingly partisan nature of media outlets. We have now, but we didn't used to have. Fox, MSNBC, bringing a particular overlay bias to their reporting. Jon Stewart did a wonderful bit on his show. And if you're not watching Jon Stewart, you're not paying attention. It's just amazingly wonderful commentator on actually how the media and the hypocrisy of reporting and how they are often not doing their job. And he did a wonderful thing about the way Rachel Maddow on MSNBC covered the Tea Party protest, ridiculing them as ignorant, racist, homophobic hicks. And now the way Fox News is now covering the Occupy Wall Street protest, ridiculing them as druggies, hippies, ne'er-do-wells. And an on-screen headline during the Fox and Friends segment declared, "Creepy criminals infiltrate Wall Street protest." And I got that from James Rainey's column in the LA Times, but as he pointed out, this was not intended as satire, folks. Creepy criminals. So the point is, when it comes to reporting the news, the trivialization can work both ways. When news outlets allow biases to color the coverage. I saw a photo of one protester holding a sign that said, "The press won't interview me because I look too normal." And the interesting thing is that I saw that photo on Facebook. I didn't see it in a report. I saw it on Facebook and laughed at it. My Facebook page has better stuff about OWS than some of the reporting I'm seeing. And I also remember when I was covering, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, invaded, it's the wrong word, isn't it? Well, whatever. I was reporting for ABC News, and I was in San Francisco, and covering a protest up there. And there was real back and forth in New York about whether they wanted to put that on the air. Because the stuff I was hearing from my editors in New York was, "Oh, that's just the usual suspects. It's San Francisco." And we got it on the air. But, the fact that I included grandmothers and ordinary-looking people probably didn't please somebody. And I'm saying this is, especially post 9/11, that was, it wasn't patriotic to be out there protesting what our government was doing. So, reporters have to be careful. They have to guard against that kind of pressure. And citizen journalists have to be careful in terms of really looking at what they're being fed and seeing how it's framed and who's doing the reporting and what they're focusing on. Before you throw it over to Marc, who, knows a lot more about social media reporting than I do, but I want to just show you a little, how am I going to do this? A little clip. Can I do this from here? Oh, look at that. Oh, God, where? Okay.
Oh, at the arrow. See the little carrot?
Yeah, I see it. I'm just there. The arrow? Right there? No.
No, the firebox. Yeah, there it is.
Okay. This is, where'd he go? Where is he?
Replay.
What?
Right, replay. Under Daily Show American Pie. Yeah, there you go.
But it was
So
all.
you have to hit the volume, John?
Oh, shoot. It was queued up. Oh, well.
Yeah.
Don't worry, this is the...
You can talk over it for 10
Okay,
seconds.
so anyway, he does regular drop-ins to this story on how Occupy Wall Street is being covered, and how, in fact, the protesters are presenting their own imagery. And what he really hits on here is how it's beginning to affect the politicians and the election. And he also hits on the fact that optics, that single images, has such power that
Click on this again. I think it's your screen. You hit the full screen?
okay, we're getting there. I'm
You got $300,000? All right, better change the title of the program.
okay, it's right in here.
There's no way going to go to their head. They're not. They got a butler! Son of a bitch! Your hash, sir.
So I have time to discuss
Yeah, this is it.
Perhaps the best sign of the movement's growing popularity has to be this.
Last week on the campaign trail in Florida, Romney said this about the Occupy Wall Street movement, quote, "I think it's dangerous, this class warfare." But Monday, Romney sounded much different when meeting with voters in New Hampshire.
I don't worry about the top 1%. I worry about the 99% of Americans. So I look at what's happening on Wall Street, and my own view is, boy, I understand how those people feel.
Looks like we made it! Lefty, first of all, I look at them and I say, oh boy, move. I look at them the 99%, I say, geez, wow. There seem to be those people. So that's how you know he's making when Mitt Romney has taken both sides of the argument about you. Of course, it hasn't been all good news for the movement, for all the popularity, for all the participants, the thoughtful critiques of our power structure. There's also this. You know what? Guy on a police car, meet me at camera 3. No! No! Bad. No! Naughty! Naughty! Because here's the problem. Unfortunately, protests are often as much about optics as they are about substance. And you do not want this to be your Tiananmen Square.
I love that. She says so much more than I could, so I wanted to. But at any rate, I was just thinking about something you said, Chris, this question of where did this income disparity come from? That's the kind of question that's hard for television reporters doing pieces about protesters to even address. And then this Alice Rivlin quote, "Lucky us." I was just across the street today as a reporter reporting on what's happening with the Coliseum, people waiting up all night long to get in to see a doctor or dentist camped out. Lucky us. I mean, it's just, you don't have to be down City Hall or anywhere else to see it. It's and those are the images that are should be reported. More and more. That's where the news is. Okay.
Thank you, Judy.
I'll try and make this quick and just say enough to get me fired from the school. How many of you are journalism students? That's interesting.
Okay.
Well, I think that speaks exactly to what I have to say. I only have a few minutes. I want to cover 3 issues very quickly.
If you're going to blast a journalism school, take more time.
Okay. Well, okay in that case. I'll get out my other set of notes. I want to address 3 aspects of this. I'm going to make some very assertive, I hope provocative and disturbing comments, and I will not have enough time to explain them. So I will come off like an asshole. But you're welcome to see me afterwards, and I will be happy to sit, as my friends know, I'll be happy to sit talk to you for hours about it. So 3 issues I think are before us. Did the media miss the story initially? How has it covered it since? And why? To both questions. I begin by saying something that isn't in my notes, that I thought that Chris Smith's presentation was superb, and in fact he had a line that I didn't write down quickly enough, which was something, Chris, you had a line something like, Americans do not have the conceptual theory with which to understand what's going on. Now that's not exclusively the fault of the media, but the media contributes to that, and has contributed to it over my entire lifetime. It's not about what the last 2 weeks have been, or whether or not the internet was invented. The media did not miss the Occupy Wall Street story. The mainstream media missed the Occupy Wall Street story. The Occupy Wall Street story was, in fact, Occupy Wall Street was in fact initiated by a media organization, by a magazine called Adbusters in Canada. And from the first day, it was covered by social media and by blogs. This is where I take a little distance from what Judy said. I actually enjoy a partisan media. If it wasn't for partisan media, I wouldn't have known that the Occupy Wall Street movement was happening, because the nonpartisan media was too busy with Lindsay Lohan or whatever else it is they usually do. I have no idea because I never watch the evening news. So I was able to look at websites like Bob Scheer's very partisan Treatig or others and see that this Occupy Wall Street movement was happening. And yes, it was partisan. It was a partisan call, but for a week these people were begging the media to pay any attention to them because no attention was being paid. Not only was the more partisan, if you will, new media covering this, but even though it's a cliche, it is a cliche, especially in the journalism school, it is also true that this movement has to a great degree been spread by social media. So we have to be careful when we talk about the media. There's media and there's media. If it wasn't for social media, this thing wouldn't exist. So have to be careful with that. So it took about a week or 10 days for the mainstream media to pay attention to this. I can't prove this scientifically, but I believe that the media didn't really pay much attention until there was the mix-up with the NYPD on the Brooklyn Bridge. And when there was a bloody confrontation to be seen, then we got at least television coverage because there were good pictures. And the story anyways was easily framed as an event rather than as a movement. Now we had things that lazy reporters understand, which is confrontation, point of conflict, cops versus civilians, and this thing was covered as an event rather than an organic social movement. That means that the coverage, and this is not anything to do with Occupy Wall Street, this is inherent in the mainstream media structure, things like this are always covered in as an event rather than as an organic social movement. And now, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. The media was befuddled by not finding leaders, and therefore came up with this fabulous concoction that this movement had no goals. As we sit here today, there's a general strike in Greece with hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of people in the streets today. And we know why they're in the streets in Greece. They're in the streets because they resist the austerity measures that are being imposed by the Greek government. The folks in the Occupy Wall Street movement are doing what they're doing because they oppose the inequality, not just poverty, but the inequality of income and the immunity with which the folks on Wall Street were able to drive us off a cliff and still give themselves record bonuses while your family income has declined 7% in the last 4 years, etc. That's why it's happening, and any reporter who wants to spend 3 seconds would figure that out. But the notion that this is an example to me of the codependent relationship between much of the media and power, and much of the media and the way it covers these things. There's very few journalism students here, so I won't offend you. But the truth is that journalists love press releases, and they love leaders and spokesmen because they can go to one person and they can get the soundbite and they can get the handout and they're done because that's it. They don't have to do any reporting. They just have to assemble what they are given and then get the other side and go home and say, you decide. Torture is good, except we don't call it torture. But this thing over here is good or it's bad. You decide. We'll leave it there. The coverage, as Judy said, initially was focused on the more aberrant and the strange, and it is. I'm going to tell you, somebody comes out of the 60s movement, and I first saw Bob Scheer speak against the war when I was 17 years old. I think Bob was 18 or 19 at the time. It is easy to focus on the aberrant and on the drum circles and on the people with painted faces, etc. And it's true that they are disproportionately present in those demonstrations. And they're disproportionately present in those demonstrations because in America, Americans are complacent and docile people. And the people who participate in these sort of social movements tend to be off-center to what we consider to be the norm. And the norm in this country is quite frightening, because the norm in this country has been to protest a bad economy by aligning yourself with the people who have created the bad economy. So the question is, who's really crazy? Who's really aberrant? The hippie beating a drum who's a little off? Or the guy who drives to work, pays $5 a gallon for gasoline, sees his wages cut by 15% and believes that the solution to this is to reduce the salary of postal workers. So the real question here is not what is the nature of the Occupy Wall Street movement. To me, what journalists ought to be asking themselves is not why there's 3,000 people in a Manhattan park, but why aren't there 20 million Americans sitting down in the streets protesting the sort of inequality that Chris spoke to, continuing fall in wages, jobs with no benefits, health care at $15,000 a year policy, tuition at $100,000 for a program that will saddle you with debt for the rest of your life, and maybe or maybe not get a job, an economic class that buys our politicians of both parties, and that's why the Occupy Wall Street movement is protesting. I'm going to try and end in 2 minutes. What really concerns me is what Chris said. We are not living in normal times. We are living in a period, and I want to be very dramatic about this, we're living in a period of the most radical redistribution of wealth upward in modern history. Okay? That's not normal. This isn't like, 1980 to 2000 isn't like 1940 to 1960, even with the World War. Many of our economic assumptions that we just hold are being reordered now. Things are not going to return to the way they were. This is not just a recession. This is a restructuring of the world economy that's going to have an impact on you, your children, and your grandchildren for decades to come. And journalists don't bother with that because they cover the immediate. And that gets me to the, I want to say that what I'm worried about is that even as the coverage improves somewhat on Occupy Wall Street, because it has, that's not the issue. The issue isn't whether or not Occupy Wall Street fails. The issue is, what is the response of the American political system, the American people, and other people going to be to this radical restructuring and impoverishment and lowering of the horizon as a social movement, as a social phenomenon? Occupy Wall Street's going to go away. That isn't the issue. The issue is, why was there a Madison, Wisconsin this year? Why is there going to be a fight against Senate Bill 5 in Ohio 2 weeks from now, which is a mass movement? Why the poor coverage, which I'll squeeze in a minute? This is the real controversial part.
Yeah, I was waiting for that.
It's coming. It's built into the journalism institutions and built right into the journalism schools, by the way. And what it is it teaches journalists to have what Jay Rosen has called the view from nowhere. We're taught that the best reporters are the reporters who are neutral, objective, and balanced. Well, I will make the assertion that objectivity and balance are self-contradictory. Objectivity means truth. The truth is never balanced. The truth is the truth. The truth is not when you say torture might be good, torture might be bad. You decide. And while we're on the subject, torture is perhaps the most salient example because we've lived through 10 years where torture in this country has been codified and legalized and implemented, and we have actual studies from the Neiman labs that show us that the New York Times and the Washington Post adjusted their language to fit the political moment to make sure that they did not use the word torture. And we have all these euphemisms. So how are Americans supposed to understand that we're torturing people if it becomes taboo to torture, to use the word? So the media, this is what I'm saying, this is a 16-week class in the last 30 seconds. the media, journalists are reluctant to draw hard conclusions. That's considered to be biased. I think that's their job. I think your job is to go and to look at the Tea Party and to say, okay, I've done all the reporting on the Tea Party. I've looked at it, and this is what it is. Now you're adding value to my life as a journalist. You're telling me something. If you go and you show a picture of the Tea Party and somebody says, well, they're a bunch of, great patriots, and another person says, well, they're a bunch of white racists, and I'm sitting in my living room having a beer, and they say, well, and the reporter ends the report by saying, well, you decide. We'll leave it there, Wolf. We've learned nothing. In fact, we've been pushed back. We're more confused. It's a fear of calling things what they are, is what we have in the media. It's a fear. And it's an institutionalized fear, and it's a fear that's actually taught and reinforced by journalistic institutions and journalism schools. And the norm is journalists feel comfortable. The margin of debate that journalists feel comfortable with is whatever the margin is, whatever the limit is on Capitol Hill. So if the Democrats say this and the Republicans say that, journalists feel comfortable as that being the frame of the debate. If something falls outside that frame, it's considered aberrational. And if you report on it truthfully, and you tell what it is truthfully, then you're going to run into a lot of trouble with your editors and with your bosses and yourself. You probably don't even know how to do it because you've never been asked to do it.
Thank you. So we're going to have to be a little bit more disciplined on time.
Now you start.
Exactly, I know. Well, you never want to follow Marc Cooper, I guess.
All right, listen, first I want to thank Chris. I want to thank Chris and Gabe for putting this on. I think it's great, and every speaker has been terrific. And I don't think we're going to really answer all these questions today, but I think we should have an ongoing teach-in. I think it's great that we're doing something that the business schools and law schools don't tend to do. And in my ethics class, another thing they don't tend to do. We had a terrific speaker last night, Donald Tang, who was the vice chairman of Bear Stearns when it went down, and he was a very honest fellow. He was in charge of their dealings with China. Knows a great deal about it. He's coming back Tuesday night, because I do think we should have different points of view. So you're welcome to the Annenberg Auditorium if you can get one of the extra 20 seats we have on Tuesday night to hear the bankers, an honest banker's perspective. I do want to address this partisan issue. Those of us who work on the internet, I have an article today, Leonard Keller. Keller was the executive editor of the New York Times, who denounced the Wall Street. Now he's backed off as his readers took him to task. But it's on Huffington Post, it's on The Nation, it's on our own website. But I quote Ron Paul very favorably. And I do think there are points of commonality between the Tea Party movement and the Occupy Wall Street that the media is missing. They're both in touch with a rage that most of the pundits don't feel. They're feeling the pain. They want to respond. They're very suspicious of Wall Street. Ron Paul's statement in the debate of the Republicans was as good as I would have given, better actually, better. He said, don't blame the victims. He took on Kahn. He said, it is Wall Street and their allies in Washington. He condemned the bailout. He said, if you're going to give money away, why not give it to the homeowners who are suffering rather than to the banks who have savaged them? And it was very clear. And I want to, I did like some of the remarks of recent reporting from nowhere. And I was thinking about my own career, because I certainly don't think of our website as partisan, since we attack Obama more regularly than we do anyone else, because he happens to be president. But I was thinking, when I get my own ideas, and I am an old guy, and it happened through no fault of my own that my father lost his job the day I was born. In 1936, probably the worst year of the Depression, and he didn't get back for 4 years. So we survived off the WPA and CCC and these things, as did Ronald Reagan, by the way, who in his book, whereas the rest of his autobiography said Roosevelt was a god in his house, because his father went to work for the New Deal. And I knew Reagan quite well, interviewed him from the hours and many hours of waiting. Other journalists, and Reagan was very clear. He used to say, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And he was very clear about the obligations of society to even the playing field. And ironically, Reagan as president tightened regulations rather than loosen. That was not his intention, but because of the savings and loan scandal, he was forced to tighten. And it was actually a very interesting exchange in Don Regan's book, his Treasury Secretary, where Reagan said, what is GE doing? And Reagan says Reagan was offended by what had happened to the very company that he had been a shill for, because they were shipping jobs abroad. And so the same problem we have now with GE, where Immelt, who is the head of Obama's Jobs Council, is actually head of a company, GE, that has 2/3 of its employees abroad and 82% of its profit. And yet he's the head of the Jobs Council. So I want to make it clear, I don't think this is a partisan issue. I do think it represents perspective, and I want to not take up too much time. I want people to read what I've written to get my full view. But when I went to cover the deregulation, I was still a reporter at the Los Angeles Times, and we had very good editors, and we actually had very good publishers in my tenure there. But it was very clear they were not seeing this the way I was seeing it. And it had started with the Telecommunications Act. First of all, it started with the end of the poverty program. We don't have a federal poverty program thanks to Clinton's deregulation. That's the group that's really suffering. Welfare rolls have not increased. The poor are, now 46 million of them, 22% of children. We don't even discuss that one. But my newspaper, as was the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, were really interested in deregulation. They wanted to own a station in the same market as the print. They wanted to have the synergy with magic words. And they had an interest in this. And they were owned by people who were going to benefit from deregulation. And those are the people they had lunch with. Those were their investors. Those are the people themselves. So there is something of a ruling class. Okay, accuse me of class warfare. But it's out there. I've worked for it. Some of them are my best friends. I invite them to my class and so on. But don't be confused about it. So when I was covering this thing, I moved over from telecommunications, and I moved over to the financial deregulation, Clinton's famous triangulation. And since time is so limited, let me give it to you in one sentence. The thing we're talking about that occupied Wall Street is not a problem of capitalism. It's a problem of swindling. If the mafia had done it, they'd all be, in jail forever or killed. All right. These are the gimmicks, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps will be illegal under any sane capitalist system. They didn't exist really before the 1980s in any sense. They only came into their own after Clinton signed off on the Financial Services Modernization Act and the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, Titles 3 and 4 of which said there will be no regulation by any existing law or regulatory agency of collateralized debt obligations and credit default swaps, which are at the heart of the problem. That's where the toxic mortgages come from. So this whole thing didn't have to happen. It was a swindle, okay? And it was not reported by the media. The media was waving the flag for deregulation and celebrating it. Time magazine had 3 who saved the world: Robert Rubin, Greenspan, Summers. And we don't have time, or I would read from the reporting, but the chair, and that's why I went after Kelly today. Kelly was the managing editor of the New York Times and then the executive editor. And there are exceptions, the Gretchen Morgensterns, the Paul Krugmans. My book is all based on mainstream reporting. So we have great reporters out there, and they can do great work. I'm not discounting that, including the Wall Street Journal. I read the Wall Street Journal every night, and I read the New York Times, and my book documents everything from mainstream sources. But the reality is that these institutions were pushing in the other direction. And sometimes they would just tell you it's boring and get off it, Bob, or it's obviously needed, or you don't understand it. Well, come on, I was a graduate student in economics, I do understand it. And so the disconnect that occurred is this incredibly important shift in our society. The radical deregulation of Wall Street allowed these new gimmicks, the packaging, the derivatives that represent hundreds of trillions of dollars of wealth. And as CEO after CEO has testified, they didn't understand it. It was what Michael Parks once used to say about journalists not checking their story. Too good to check. If you check it, it might fall apart. So AIG didn't want to know what the London Bureau was doing because the money was pouring in. And if we checked it, my God, it might even be criminal. We better not look too carefully. So to summarize, you had a specific swindle that the media did not cover because of institutional bias generated by the ownership patterns, expansion, and so forth. Free press is guaranteed only to those who own one. Great A.J. Liebling quote. Thanks to the alternative media, we actually have now room for questioning, and that puts pressure on the mainstream media to do a better job. As Krugman pointed out, he was reading about it elsewhere, and then he blasted NPR for not covering these protests for 9 days. And as I say, we have the wonderful journalists out there, wherever they work, who at the end of the day want to act in a principled way. I don't mean to debate our journalism department or anyone else. Some of my best friends, including my wife, is a journalist, but I don't want to let our profession off the hook. We blew it. We blew it because of the prejudices, the biases built into our business, our profit-making business, and we wrote the story from the point of view of Wall Street. And the reason you have Occupy Wall Street is that very well-educated people in the main, I've looked at the surveys, I've looked at the polls, and by the way, 72% of New Yorkers, 69% of New Yorkers say that they support this demonstration. So it's not some fringe group, and 72% they say they should stay there forever, even though they don't. Well, it's a good thing. No, it's a good thing to call attention to this. So I just want to summarize. This didn't have to happen. It's not the normal functioning of capital. Those are real problems. We can talk about them. This was a specific scam enabled by the media. Had the media done its work, it would not have happened. Had the politicians done their work, it would not have happened. And then, to compound it, the bailout bailed out the people who caused the swindle, caused all the misery, okay, and did nothing for the homeowners. And the end result, Martin Luther King statue went up the other day. I was a big fan of Martin Luther King. I interviewed him and knew him quite well. Martin Luther King said, economic question is the basic question in this society. What has happened? 60% of Hispanic, Latino wealth, not income, total wealth, has been wiped out by this. 60%, wiping out all the gains for Latinos. 53% of African American wealth has been wiped out. Those are 2-year-old figures conducted by the Pew Research Center. It's worse now. To have wiped out the economic gains that we have registered in this last 40 years. Your income inequality is now approaching Depression-era levels. Real income is back to where it was in the 70s, and we have a debt that tells us we can't do anything about it, because otherwise the Chinese communists, who we want to make the scapegoat for this, will stop financing our system.
Thank
Oh, me?
Put your, what you probably got to say.
Yeah. Okay.
I defer.
So now we're going to be joined by Professor Allison Schroeder from the Communications School on the topic of social movement and visual culture of protest.
Chris, are you able to give her a little hand on that?
Okay, so I'm going to begin with two historical examples, both to set the stage for a discussion of visual culture of protest, and then, move centuries to the present day to talk about OWS. First, the famous painting by Francisco Goya, the 3rd of May, 1808, depicting the Spanish resistance to the French and Napoleon's attempts to extend the French Empire. The other painting, Pablo Picasso's Guernica, depicts the Spanish Civil War and the bombing of the town by German and Italian armies. And I point to these two examples to demonstrate the way visual culture has been important to politics historically, both as documenting particular events, but also as instigators, that they are meant to also instigate action. Going forward, my other historical example, the other image, depicts another bombing more directly tied to Wall Street. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were actually regular demonstrations on Wall Street that culminated in a terror attack on J.P. Morgan in 1920. And one thing, if we look at the history books and look at the history, the demonstrators were from, in similar ways to today, a range of groups. So you had populist, Socialist Party members, labor union members, communists, anarchists, and the common target among all of these groups was Wall Street. So speaking to what Tom talked about before, the culture of public protest in American history. This one is from 2008. Wall Street again surfaced as a target in popular culture as well as art, particularly with the recession and the financial crisis kind of making the news. And this is a 2008 piece of public art depicting a kind of literal financial meltdown staged in front of the Supreme Court. So we have another key historical marker of visual protest. Then we move into, as Marc talked about, adbusters and the kind of roots of this protest. They put feelers out on their website in July and used this ad in their magazine with the hashtag tying in social networking and the importance of social networking. We also want to think about the importance of adbusters and their tendency to use culture jamming as a kind of activist stage or activist kind of style. So Adbusters is largely credited with instigating OWS using this kind of guerrilla-style campaign that is explicitly inspired, as it says there, by the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square. I want to take a moment, when we're talking about visual protest, we want to think about targets. And clearly, the 99-to-1 or the 99% has been one of the clearest messages and the clearest targets in the OWS movement so far. But I want to isolate a few targets that stand out among what are a seemingly endless number of images available online. And I spent the last couple of days kind of trolling the internet trying to find all these images. Targets, when we're talking about visual protests, are important, and visual targets are important because they can signify a common enemy, a place to direct anger and frustration, and speak to the narratives that are also sort of important when we're telling a story, right? So the 99%, again, is probably the most clear visual and textual message, I would say, coming out of OWS. In simple percentage point and ratio, it makes the argument for us. It captures the key issue of inequity and class divide. It also frames the protest, I would say, importantly around identity and identity politics. So it ties in that way to other social movements. The other kind of target that I isolated by looking at a lot of these images is the fact that even though now we're seeing this as more of a global movement in some ways, the original target, of course, is not only the financial center, but what it stands for more broadly, American capitalism and corporate power. So in addition to the flags, we see other images that surface that tie American references specifically to the problem. Speaking to Bob's point about swindlers, I think it's also interesting to consider the sort of more recent targeting of billionaires in New York City and sort of trying to also put a literal face on the problem. Another target that I've seen arisen is the actual currency. So Occupy George is a website. It's a spin-off kind of DIY movement that promotes the defacing of dollar bills with Occupy-inspired messaging. Okay. Along with the identifiable targets to direct the movement, in particular directions, another facet of visual activism that we can see in Occupy's messaging is the need to tap into common experience, common emotion, and common references that we all have. So one other common kind of visual that we see in among a lot of the protesters is the raised fist. Such commonalities, of course, speak to and serve as mechanisms to rally support. The popularly recognized raised fist has historical roots, yet is regularly appropriated as a symbol for the underdog or the oppressed group that's united in its fight against the dominant group. These images were all taken by our grad student Kevin Driscoll at the Occupy LA. Downtown, and I think one of the things he captured in these images is that we get other symbols that directly reference or appropriate iconic images from popular culture, whether it's the Monopoly guy, the Louis Vuitton, the luxury house, comic book and film characters. So we've got Yoda and Captain America. But speaking to comic and film references, I think we also need to think about how these references are used by protesters who seek to maintain a kind of anonymity. Referencing both the historical figure Guy Fawkes as well as the comic series that appropriated his image and later adapted into the film V for Vendetta. So those tied to the hacktivist group Anonymous are the ones linked to these masks and sort of have popularized them. At the same time, if we look on the other side of the coin of anonymity, we want to see and talk about maybe another prevalent facet of everyday popular media and trends in political and social activism, particularly in the context of the celebrity activist. So here we see crossover between OWS and WikiLeaks, with Julian Assange making a display of himself in London. We see Cornel West and Susie Orman. I don't have a picture of her actually there, but she supposedly is behind it, as well as figures from the entertainment arena. But I think the most important kind of thing we can take away as far as visuals is, despite the presence of celebrity, which can in some cases offer a kind of legitimacy and a kind of visibility to a social or political cause, much of the imagery that we see on a daily basis coming out of the OWS is largely ephemeral, largely makeshift. And the majority of signs we see, I think, are these cardboard kind that are scrawled with messages in kind of average form handwriting. The messages are diffuse. They feel spontaneous, even hasty in some ways. MoveOn.org's campaigns come to mind here, especially the recent ones tied to healthcare reform. And so these signs, I think, are important because they show not only a kind of individual style in the way an individual puts their own kind of mark on the movement, but a unique play, a clever wordplay on a particular individual's take. So despite the ephemeral nature of these materials, I want to go back to a point I made about visual documentation. That the visual documentation of these messages online and social media is what's important. I got most of these not only from Kevin, but also from trolling Facebook and other websites to sort of find how these messages have been spreading. And the way in which, and Kevin pointed this out to me, that there is almost like a gallery kind of going on where people will sort of put all their signs together and even put signs back if they've fallen down. So there's a kind of documentation, a kind of archiving that's really going on within social media. On the other side of the DIY spectrum is an attempt to formalize the messaging. So you're still doing it yourself, but you're choosing from one of many templates that are conveniently downloadable. So the revolution will be PDF'd to some degree. And so you can download these posters. These are some of the PDFs you can download to make over your dollar bills. And I think it speaks to also the way in which, again, social media works, but the way in which infographics work on the web is an important source of data, where we have a kind of visualization of not only the argument, but visuals that we can take and then use on our own. So even as we streamline the messages in these kinds of examples, there also remain other kind of provocative examples of protests, and this one started back in 2008, this group, or this artist, and who's inspired this kind of group of naked protests. We've seen a lot of naked pictures today. But the notion of using performance and visual shock as a kind of protest, I think, is also an important element. And finally, I'm going to just end with this image and think about the fact that despite the fact that we have the ephemeral nature or this kind of one-off performance piece, with this kind of makeshift quality of visual messaging and criticism, We also want to think about the role of maps as another kind of visual that we see in Occupy Wall Street. And again, I want to point out that these maps are both markers, they're kind of documentation of the movement's progress, but they also can be seen as modes of instigation, just as we talked about at the beginning. So they're showing the community, they're showing the grassroots nature of this activism at work and the power of the grassroots movement when you see all of these little tabs on the map. So the Occupy movement, on the one hand, has been criticized for being decentralized, but I think it's ultimately also discussed as being inclusive. And I think that becomes a kind of important point. So going back to Goya and Picasso, it's unclear whether we'll see anything akin to a single work, but I don't think that's the kind of period we're in. And I think we want to kind of think about how we are still seeing stories and narratives pop up. We see the targets pop up as far as who these groups are targeting. We see an audience that they're addressing. We see their goals come up in the visual pieces here. And so it's more an issue in our present day, as Marc was saying, of the strategies of sort of conveying these messages, but also the distribution methods and how these messages sort of come to us. So I'll end with that.
Professor Dan Durbin, Kahn School, Kahn faculty.
Since I can't see anyone, I'll walk up here. Hey, there's an audience. In the interest of full disclosure, I was more than happy. By the way, we're running over time already, so I was more than happy for the first time. I had rather extensive and somewhat invasive oral surgery last night for about 3.5 hours. And to be brutally frank, I am on enough painkillers to have made one hell of a good party in 1967. So if I start becoming less and less understandable, there are reasons for that. I think that one of the interesting things here, and one of the questions that always arises in this kind of discussion is how do you place this movement within the history of social movements, or in our understanding of social movements? Why is this a movement? And how do we define it as such? It's an interesting question, partially because everybody defines their own movement as a movement, and everybody else defines it as not a movement for some political activity. So if you look on Fox and watch their coverage of the Occupy Wall Street, you will see them talk about it as being a political movement largely backed by the Democratic Party and or the liberal bloc and or the liberal power base and or the communists, who still for some reason people in Western civilization. I still can't figure out why. And if you look at MSNBC and others, the Tea Party, in fact, I actually had an interesting situation this back about a year and a half ago. I was on CBS Evening News, and they were asking me about the Tea Party, and they were trying to get me to talk of it as a purely partisan Republican Party ploy, as opposed to something that involved real outrage and real people trying to move forward some kind of social change. If we look at historically how our field has discussed social movements, and like I said, I'm going to do this if I can, somebody time me, 1.5 minutes, I'm going to give myself. If we look at this in the context of how we understand social movements, I mean, classically we've looked at social movements as these activities taken up by people who are out of power, who find something wrong with the social or political environment, want to change it in some way, and try to put pressure on the system, usually theoretically externally, in order to bring about that change. They're then helped along by interested red horse. But as we've discussed here today, movements like the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street blur that distinction to a great degree for a couple of reasons. One is that many of them already have interested red horse who have some power in media, giving them access to the media and helping to move forward the discussion. Another thing that changes all rules is, in a sense, we are in a pure media age in which everybody has some access to some media. My notes are currently on, for what I'm saying here, currently on a perpetually dying iPhone. But this is also my source for putting things onto a blog. I can tweet off of this, and I can certainly film all of you and send it to the internet. So don't do anything awkward, or don't do any of the naked stuff they do on that, because I can send it up right now onto the internet. And that then changes the context of communication and the means of communication to the audience. And so you have a shift in how social movements occur. And so to say that a social movement is generated by people out of power solely for, or primarily out of power, trying to put pressure on those in some form of power, it becomes a little muddled in our discussion when we start talking about the way in which social movements are occurring today. Now, I agree with Bob, especially about two things here. Number one, this is about a swindle. Number two, I believe a lot of you were the ones at the Tea Party, there are similarities. Yeah, there are similarities that are of interest about the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street movement, but more particularly, I think one of the most valuable things in Bob's presentation is his passion, because that is one of the core similarities here. People are pissed off, and moreover, people are scared. And that fear is driving the anger, and it is driving the communication. And people now have access much more freely to means to communicate broadly, and that latent fear can show up very quickly on media. So the dynamic has changed greatly in how a social movement evolves. What does that then say about Occupy Wall Street? Will it simply die out? Will it grow into an international social movement? Is it part of a social movement that is already occurring internationally, where people are protesting in different ways the various financial problems that exist around the world? One thing I think that is of value to examine here is the trajectory of the Tea Party when you start talking about Occupy Wall Street, because they do begin with the same passion, they do begin with the same anger, they begin with different political positions. But there is a trajectory to the Tea Party that moves from some people starting this discussion to media groups supporting it and giving it access to the broad American public, to the Republican Party co-opting it and attempting to use this then as a form of political force to gain votes. There's been discussion recently about the Democratic Party attempting to co-opt the Occupy Wall Street movement. And I do not have the time to, and I know I've broken my minute and a half 2 minutes ago. I'm sorry. Back with a little ibuprofen, because I think the world seems to change place. I think one of the interesting things to look at here, just to conclude very quickly, one of the interesting things to look at here are these attempts to co-opt the movement and how that then redefines the movement, because most people now look at the Tea Party as a kind of a leg of the really pissed off leg of the Republican Party. Where in fact that's not really a purely accurate representation of it. And if a political party can co-opt the Occupy Wall Street and begin to redefine it as part of their culture, that can also create a perspective in the popular mind that this is not a pure social movement, that this is being driven by the political powers. And you're going to have somebody else get really pissed off out there and start another social movement because they're scared, because they're angry, because nobody's coming up with real ways in which to fix this problem, and because they start seeing, if this pattern recurs, they start seeing the other movements being co-opted by political parties who already got us into this mess. So it has potential for a lot of interesting discussion and thought. And by the way, I thought everybody here was great.
Okay, thank you all for sticking around here. I know our time is officially up, but we can certainly occupy the Cowan Forum for a little bit longer. And I do want to turn over to questions. I want to also just again thank our speakers and say that, I think one thing that emerges here is just how central media, the failings of media, and the sort of form and institutions of media are to this coverage. Anyone who has seen stuck it through to watch one of these Republican debates can, I think, noticed something that, as Chris alluded at the very beginning, one of the issues that I think people are struggling with here is we really don't have the framework with which to kind of evaluate the situation, and that was driven home to me by when I watched a recent Republican debate where the narrative that was emerging from that debate is that the current financial situation is the result of the failed stimulus bill and the Dodd-Frank bill, which is killing jobs and threatening the, choking off the oxygen to the financial industry. I just thought that was, again, very interesting because then I don't really see that challenge in the mainstream media in the coverage of these debates. So I think, again, we're looking at also, some serious falling down on the job by the reporting public here. So I definitely want to now start the question portion of this, and we'll keep it going as long as we can. Lana.
Thank you again. That was awesome all around. The one kind of communication process that I didn't see talked about today that I just wanted to highlight is the kinds of communication process actually happening in the occupation. I'm thinking particularly of the General Assembly method, which is a form of how decisions are made very, 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 very slowly at the occupation itself. Anyone who's there is part of the decision-making process. People use hand signals such as wrap it up, which we could have made, or keep it moving. Then of course, this is that you support, this is that you don't support, but you're not willing to put a block, and this is a hard block. And anything that is hard blocked is tabled and brought up again later. And I pity the poor finance committee who is of Occupy LA, who has to kind of come before the General Assembly and suggest that they create a corporation so that the individual members of the Finance Committee are not tax liable for donations, and then have to deal with the thousands or hundreds of people at the General Assembly of Occupy LA who are hard blocking at the very word of corporation or taxes. So depending on where they stand on the spectrum. And then the thing that was so fascinating to me is in that moment in the discussion, someone from the General Assembly called for a PowerPoint and said, maybe this would be better if we had a PowerPoint to explain this to us. So it was Kevin who actually turned to me and said, yeah, PowerPoint, the revolution is wild. But I do think that in addition to these communication processes and there are also other things on the ground that are modeling an alternative economic vision at the occupation. I found a book that I wanted to use to write about the occupation at the occupation library. There's people making food, there's people setting up live streams and Wi-Fi and all kinds of stuff like that. And so I think that although those things could look a little bit or quite a bit like kind of 1960s hippie communist type thing, commune type things, it also look, in terms of making food, free food for people and hanging out, it also looks a bit to me like something else I've been reading about, which is kind of the 1940s war effort, but much less nationalist, and much more technocratic. So as we kind of look at this radical redistribution of wealth, kind of think about what kinds of processes are being modeled that might find a new way forward in this kind of heterotopic state.
She's a very persistent hand raised back there.
I'm an alum of the journalism school, when it was the journalism school, and I'm a current student here. But I started my morning, I took the train and I walked through the Occupy and spent an hour there talking to people and getting an idea of reading all the signs. And I got something of a different feel from what's been said here. On one hand, I got a feel of somebody doing extreme organization with the first aid station, the library, night meetings and all that. On the other hand, extreme disorganization of just kind of pulling people in. And I saw a lot of signs that stated certain issues. A lot of them you would typically associate with the left. But in talking to the people, there was only one person who mentioned Wall Street to me. The others mentioned that they were homeless and they were in another part of the city and they just came because there were a lot of people there. Another person said that there was a 9/11 conspiracy group in one area. Another person said that he was rejected on the jobs bill to be passed. Another person was there who said there's a lot of people smoking pot all day, but when they asked them if they voted for anything in the last election, they said no. And if they asked if they voted for legalizing marijuana, they said no. There's on one hand, on one corner, there's a bunch of anti-GMO signs, but on the other hand, they pissed off the farmers market, which has had to move across the street today. And so it doesn't seem, in some hand, it seems like there's somebody trying to convey a coherent message. But if you actually get in there and talk to people, it doesn't really seem like there's a clear
Let me respond to that by saying that I think your perceptions are probably correct. I've no doubt they're correct. This refers to what I said earlier, which is my fear about this. It's something. Let me state that this is something that excites me and that I'm sympathetic to. Okay, and I think is a good sign. My fear is that this becomes, to use an academic term, this becomes reified, that this becomes evaluated on this thing, this OWS, becomes evaluated on its particular failure or success. Let me get ahead of the curve then by saying I think it has failed in its original attempt, because its original intent, clearly to say to create a Tahrir Square, it's been 4 or 5 weeks now. That's not going to happen, okay? I'm willing to just state at no point in the foreseeable couple of weeks are 400,000 Angelinos going to go to the city hall and sit down in the street. So in that, as an event, it's probably on the downslope, okay? But that's not the issue. The issue is what undergirds it and what creates that type of populist anger, no matter how incoherent it expresses itself. And that it was Dan who said it. If you look around the world now, you have a student revolution literally taking place in Chile. You have an armed revolution that just succeeded in Libya today. You have a general strike in Greece, right? You have great China. It's a matter of time before there's great
big demonstrations in Israel.
Big demonstrations in Israel. We've had, as I said, we had the upsurge that we had in Madison earlier this year. We haven't manifested in other things. So this is part of a reaction to, yes, the particular swindle that I agree with Bob, the particular swindle that Wall Street carried out through the better part of this decade and that popped in 2008 and left us holding bag. But it's also about these bigger problems of inequality and dislocation. So, if you go, I've been there, if you go there, I'm an old 60s protester. I'm put off by the hands-on. I think it's just easier to have a majority vote, and you get on with business. Okay, that's my old fart opinion. Right? But it doesn't matter. What matters is this as a symptom of a very unequal economic system and a crisis in political representation.
Well, that's why I suggested you would go to the Coliseum today if you want to see the story.
Yeah, and if I might just comment on that also. I'm a graduate of the school. I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I took out originally $33,000 in graduate school debt. That debt currently stands at $116,000. I've been trying to get that issue in court for years and have been totally ignored. No lawyer will take my case because I can't pay them. And so my question is, how much do these protests work if you can't get something concrete like large court cases, something other than just signs on a corner?
If I can just respond, I agree with Senator Martin. I think it's a mistake to focus on the scene of the theater. And I speak of someone with considerable experience in this area, as recently as being at Occupy Oakland the other day. And I think this movement has already succeeded beyond anyone's legitimate expectation because it has changed the debate in America. Now, as you correctly pointed out in your talk, we have denied any sense of income inequality, any sense of being trapped. As when we studied economics, when I used to teach economics, we would always say, no, in America, you move through these 10%, and we don't have classes, it's not frozen, it's great opportunity. And these people, including my own relatives, and myself, when I participated, although no one, I noticed that no one needed me to speak. I was well known. I ran for Congress up there once. I'm in that community. I'm on the radio there. My column was in the Chronicle all the time. No one felt the need to ask me for enlightenment, which I thought was marvelous, because these people, whatever you say, they're coming from different places. They felt empowered, and they didn't really need another hotshot, talking. But what they've done is change the debate, and it's not going to go away. The cat is out of the bag. This 99, if you just take the 1% and the 99%, which is a devastating statistic.
Branding is great.
Devastating, yes. And it means that you saw it with Romney. No politician can ignore it now. No academic can ignore it, or pundit, or so forth. And once the movements survive only if they're touched into some truth. Unless you have outrageous demagogues who deceive people for a long time. The reason the anti-war movement survived was not whether we had the right tactic at a demonstration, or we did this, or we took our clothes. We had endless debates about it. Should women be bare-breasted? Oh, great.
Again.
I know. In fact, this guy, I recall once where this guy denounced me because I wasn't militant enough or something. Here at USC, he was one of the radicals taping me. But anyway, the civil rights movement, I remember the same arguments in the civil rights movement. If you go through these movements, they succeed only if they touch people about a reality that has been ignored. The Vietnam War movement succeeded because the establishment, its intellectuals, was lying, misinforming people for the reasons for the war, the success, and what have you. Same thing with the civil rights movement. No, moderation in the South is not working. No, it's not getting gradually better. No, something dramatic has to be done. And as we've all said today, with a surprising agreement, this issue of income distribution is now front and center in America.
Leilani, you have a question?
No, I just want to say that I think to say that it's a failure, I think that's, I totally disagree. I think that people are just like coping or just dealing with the fact that they lost their homes. It's like losing a child, or that there is no more American dream. And right now, with the way I see Occupy LA, it's like they're just like trying to come to terms with the fact that they may not have a job. So if you think it's going to be run like a mini United Nations or Congress, then you're just bullshitting yourself. It's going to take a long time. I think it's different from the anti-war movement and like the anti-racist movement, because people are dealing with like this very fundamental thing about what they believe about America, which is that we can do anything, we can achieve anything. If we just get our education, we'll be okay. Well, right now it's we're realizing that that's not true. So let people have their space and just stop criticizing, and just and I think what you have to do, I think, as journalists, is to like meet people where they're at, and stop saying, well, because you don't follow this agenda or some time frame, therefore you're wrong. I think people have to. We have to fully understand where they are psychologically and spiritually, and then we can probably do a decent news story.
Leilani, nobody has said that.
Nobody said that.
When I said, and I'm going to respond because I'm the one who used the word failure, it failed as a reproduction of Tahrir Square, is what I said. And that doesn't mean it is a failure. It failed to produce a social revolution on which this was modeled. I think what Bob said is absolutely correct. It has succeeded in changing the political discourse and pushing the question of inequality into the mainstream, an issue that's been totally ignored by the media and by the political class. In fact, the only time we hear class warfare is from the lips of millionaires, which is an upside-down world. So it has succeeded. The only point I was making was that for your own good, for those who feel most partisan about this, be careful, because this movement will come and go per se. It will come and go because you need a bigger movement and you need a more effective movement, and this may be the first step, which is fine. That's not a matter of, and you get there through critical thinking and through real evaluations, and you get stronger by understanding what your weaknesses are instead of just saying, "Aw shucks, isn't this cute?" Right. Yeah, it's cute, or it's not cute. Yes, it has great moral legitimacy. Then you have to ask the hard questions. How do you translate that into social change? Or does it just become therapy for people who are involved in the activity? Right? These are questions that they're inherent in every social movement, including this one.
Right over here.
I have two quick comments about things that were said, but then I really do have a question. And I want to start by saying, totally respect, it seems like everybody here has a legacy of social change, but just because we may be young doesn't mean we don't have a legacy of social change. My first protest was the Million Man March. I was 4, I was a little mama stroller. Like, I grew up doing this, and I know that these things wax and wane, but this is the most momentum I have ever seen for a protest that my friends or I have ever protested in. I have never seen anything, even when we first declared war and there were protests every weekend in DC, it was not on this scale. So my 2 points were, I don't know if you heard Morning Edition this morning, but NPR tried to get Adbusters to comment on starting Occupy Wall Street, and they refused because they said they didn't. So I think that to say that the initial intent of this movement was an Arab Spring is wrong. The discontent was there. I'm not sure that Adbusters quantified it. Even if Adbusters hadn't called for something like this, I think something like this may have been inevitable. And then I also feel that it's true, a lot of the people that you talk to come from very different backgrounds, and perhaps they're not the most aware or activized as we would like, ideally. But certainly one thing that they all have in common is that they have been disenfranchised and are unhappy with the status quo hierarchical power. So they do have something very important in common, and I'm not sure that, since this is new, I'm not sure they need anything more in common than being unhappy and disenfranchised. And then my final question is, because I think that this has a lot of potential, and I think that everybody here seems to be behind it on some level, how can we increase awareness? I was aware of this pretty early on because my friends are the kind of people that go to these things. It's like second Christmas for them. So I heard about it on Facebook within a week of it getting started, but when I tell other people about it, there's still a 50% chance that they haven't heard of this. And I'm not even sure that we can quantify this as the average American. These are other educated, liberal people that have not heard of this. What? I'm serious. I'm absolutely serious. How can we increase awareness?
Have not heard of it.
Even though we have more increased media coverage from the mainstream media, excuse me, we have multiple medias, there are a lot of people who don't know. How do we increase awareness? Oh, great ones.
Let me answer the oh, great one. Old one. No, it's the old one. Let me just say, I don't think this is a real issue. I think this thing has passed the critical mass of attention. Whether some people have heard it or not, it's out there. Yeah, it's out. I'm just speaking now as a media person. I can tell you, our site's traffic has gone off the charts. We're not alone. Huffington Post, everyone else I know, our system has crashed 4 times. And one of the reasons is we have Chris Hedges, who, by the way, was an establishment journalist, New York Times bureau chief. I think if there's an intellectual vision behind this, Chris is one of the key people in his writing. He's referenced very often in these demonstrations. Occupy Wall Street has his column almost as fast as we do, and so forth, and there are others. So I think the thing has been noticed. I think the main thing that has happened for youth is that the Obama generation, and I think it was a real generation, I know my own son, who's the editor of our site, went to Nevada to work for Obama. I even went to Nevada. Okay, so I think that generation has gotten a crash course. I agree with you very much in your enthusiasm. I mean, your sense that something big is happening. A crash course that I don't know that I remember in the anti-war movement, we had the slogan, maybe you weren't born yet, part of the way with LBJ was our slogan. SDS, we remember it now, it's some wild, radical time. But that was the button we wore. Part of the way with LBJ. Why? Because, well, we're still Democrats and there's still a poverty program, but he could just end this nasty little war, then we'd have the money for this. My slogan when I ran for Congress was end the war in Vietnam, end poverty in Oakland, and people who came out of it will now control the seat, Rondell's and others. So I think the real test for this movement will not be whether they can sustain a rally. The rally will have, by the way, I can assure you, if we had a different mayor now, and he wasn't feeding these people, but instead was crushing them, we would have 300,000 people. I can assure you, we would have 300,000 people downtown. There's no question about it. But in fact, as we, even with the problems in New York, the fact is the city, its leading columnists like President, they have embraced it. Okay, people have given it its due. So it's not comparable to Egypt. We're not having a monarchy. We're not worried about the police coming and smashing our heads and so forth. So there's less urgency about getting out there at night. I know you brought cookies the other night. I felt guilty. Why am I not going with you? And then I thought, no, I don't have to go take cookies to the 7. Let her. She can do it by herself. I'm going to go have a good meal somewhere. But my point is that we struggle for the mind of a generation, which is really what this is. Okay, which is what the anti-war movement was about. And everybody talked about alienation, rebellion, blah, blah. No, it was a struggle for the mindset of young people. Are they going to follow a career track and go into the Democratic Party or whatever, and just work within the system, accept marginal change, and then slowly sell out? Selling out was the big word. Will you sell out? Well, we didn't hear that for the last, 20 years. No one here at Annenberg worries about selling out. They want to sell out. They have programs designed to help you sell out.
They're for sale themselves.
How much more can we do to sell out and help you sell out? Okay, that whole thing has changed now. Overnight, really, has changed. Right now you have a whole group of people out there who are saying, wait a minute, how do I avoid selling out? What kind of job can I get to keep going, and so forth. So I think that in that sense, there's no going back.
Yeah.
Could I just add something? Quite frankly, if you know people who haven't heard of this, I wouldn't care about alerting them because they're clearly...
Which sadly is a large portion of our undergraduate student population.
And graduate.
On that note, yeah.
But thank you all very much.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Great brief announcement. Just a quick, which is that there's lots of people doing research in this area, and we're trying to connect people, especially who are at SC. So if you want to talk to me, that's one way, but we've also gotten the habit of tagging things in various social media sites with Occupy Research as one word. So I'm going to see some of the images we're collecting or links or things like that, then that's a good entry point. So thanks for...
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah.